sir. All right, everybody all set? All right, good afternoon. I'm Pinellas County Sheriff Bob Gualtieri, and we're here today to announce the formation of the Pinellas County Use of Deadly Force Task Force. Use of force by anyone, including law enforcement officers, requires that there be a criminal homicide investigation conducted. A homicide occurs when someone dies at the hands of someone else. And not all homicide investigations are, quote, murder investigations, as some cases when they're homicides are lawful. As an example, a legally justifiable homicide occurs when it's committed by a police officer in the lawful performance of his or her duty. For the last close to 40 years that I know of, most Pinellas County law enforcement agencies have conducted our own homicide investigations when our officers and deputies use deadly force. The homicide investigation conducted by the law enforcement agency is an addition to the independent and parallel investigation that is conducted by the state attorney's office. In this model, where agencies conduct their own homicide investigations when their officers and deputies use deadly force, and that parallel investigation by the prosecutor is consistent with the model that is used in many places throughout Florida and many places throughout the United States. Now, this model that we've used here in Pinellas County has worked, and we have conducted fair, objective, and accurate investigations. And nobody in Pinellas County gets a pass just because they happen to be a cop. Proof of this working well is a situation, unfortunately, that occurred a couple years ago in Madeira Beach when former Deputy Timothy Verdon shot a guy at Johns Pass Village, and we subsequently arrested Deputy Verdon because he improperly used deadly force. So the system works, and it is done thoroughly and objectively, and we do reach the right result. But times have changed, and these times that we're in continue to evolve, and regardless of whether we actually do it right, which we have, it has to be perceived by the community as being done right, and that means perceived as being done objectively and impartially to reach a just result. That also means that in these times it's necessary to change and to put a process in place whereby the agency conducting the investigation of an officer or deputy who uses deadly force is not the agency that employs that officer or deputy. This change is not because of any incident or because of any issue or anyone calling out what the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office, the St. Petersburg Police Department, the Clearwater Police Department, the Pinellas Park Police Department, or any other law enforcement agency in Pinellas County has done or has not done. This is about us as law enforcement agency heads recognizing the times in which we live and the need to prevent something from becoming an issue despite our confidence in how we have acted up to this point. This is about public trust and confidence in outcomes and making sure that when a determination is made that people not only know it's the right determination, but believe it's the right determination. It's therefore that we announce today the creation and immediate implementation of the Pinellas County Use of Deadly Force Task Force. This task force will investigate all uses of deadly force by our officers and deputies, or force used that is not deadly force but results in serious bodily injury or death. So let me give you an example of that, real clear. Deputy discharges a firearm, that's somebody, that's the use of deadly force. Deputy is engaged in a foot pursuit and chasing somebody down the street. As the deputy's chasing that person, the deputy deploys his or her taser, the person falls, hits their head, and later dies. The use of a taser is not deadly force. A foot chase is not deadly force, but as a result of the deputy's action, the person suffered serious bodily injury or death, even though it wasn't originally deadly force. That would be covered by this and would require that homicide investigation. The task force will also conduct all criminal investigations arising out of the deadly force incident. So an example is that somebody, US 19, Alderman Road in Palm Harbor, goes in and two people go in and rob a bank. Deputy arrives, they have an exchange of gunfire. and the deputy shoots and kills one of the bank robbers. Well, the other bank robber who was not killed would be charged with felony murder because they were engaged in that, and that entire criminal incident will be investigated by the task force. So it will not just be the deputy's use of force, but the entire criminal incident. The task force will be comprised of 3 experienced homicide detectives from the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office, the St. Petersburg Police Department, and the Clearwater Police Department, and 1 detective from the Pinellas Park Police Department. So St. Pete, Clearwater, and the Sheriff's Office are each contributing 3. Pinellas Park is contributing 1. The agency whose officer or deputy is involved in that deadly force incident will never participate in the homicide investigation, and it will be independently conducted by the task force and supervised by the responsible agency head. So any use of deadly force incidents by Pinellas County Sheriff's Office deputies that occur south of Ulmerton Road, the investigative entity who's responsible for that will be Chief Holloway and the St. Petersburg Police Department. Any Pinellas County Sheriff's Office deputy that uses deadly force north of Ulmerton Road, it'll be Chief Slaughter and the Clearwater Police Department. In the city of St. Petersburg, if an officer from St. Pete PD uses deadly force, then the sheriff will be conducting and be responsible for that investigation and leading the task force. And the same thing in Clearwater or any of the other cities within Pinellas County. All this is laid out in the agreement that we've all signed. We'll give you a copy of that, and it lays it out in more specificity. And by entering into this contract, we are subordinating our authority to another agency head who will have full discretion and authority to make factual and legal findings and determinations regarding our officers and deputies' use of deadly force. The agency head, whether it's me or Chief Slaughter or Chief Holloway, that is overseeing that investigation will have the independent authority to find the use of deadly force to be within the law or outside the law, and if outside the law, to take the necessary and appropriate action, including making an arrest and bringing criminal charges against an officer or deputy if warranted, as we unfortunately had to do a couple years ago with Tim Verdon. This is a dramatic shift in long-term and entrenched policies and practices by law enforcement agencies in Pinellas County. But we believe it's the right thing to do at the right time. As I said, we'll make a copy of the agreement available at the end of the press conference. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Chief Holloway and to Chief Slaughter for remarks that they want to make, and then we'll take any questions when they're finished.
Thanks, Sheriff, and I'll be really brief. So every responsible law enforcement leader essentially looks continually inward at their agency and their agency practices to reflect on changes and improvements that would improve the police organization and reassure the public our organizations are professional and procedurally just. Today, with the announcement of this new structure for investigating incidents involving officers' use of deadly force, the Pinellas County Use of Deadly Force Task Force will provide a system to conduct investigations that objectively collect and evaluates evidence, reviews all the available facts, and makes a non-biased charging decision without the perceived or real influence of the involved agency or personnel from the involved agency. This improved process is a large component of a multifaceted system with several levels of oversight and review of an officer's use of deadly force. The Sheriff spoke to it. The activities of this task force are not the only level of review. There are 2 other levels of independent review. The Office of the State Attorney will still conduct their independent parallel investigation, and the involved departments still have a responsibility for an administrative review to make sure that whether criminality did not occur, but policy and procedures were also complied with. Officer-involved shootings in our area are very rare, and I certainly would love to say that they are non-existent at some point. But this is why we spend so much time training and promoting a philosophy of the preservation of life, and that's our primary role and responsibility. The recognition of this value of life is what drives our desire and commitment and obligation to make sure that these incidents that result in the death of our citizens are properly and fully investigated to the highest level of accountability. And I would like to promote, or not promote, I would like to stress the rarity of these in our area, in our jurisdiction, are not regular occurrences. However, that does not mean that they are not important, and that does not mean that they are not worthy of our highest level of attention, which is why I believe that this system will provide a highest level of accountability possible, and I think it will serve our public very well. Chief Holloway?
Good afternoon. I want to thank everyone. First of all, I want to thank the sheriff and the other chief for taking part in this task force. When the sheriff brought this up, it was a great timing, not because anything has happened, but about a time for a change. As both the sheriff said and Chief Slaughter said, this is going to be about adding on trust to our community. And the only thing I can say is different for St. Pete would be we will still follow the same procedures, except once the case is cleared through or once the case is reviewed by the Office of Professional Standard, it will still be forwarded to our Citizen Review Committee, which has been in effect since 1991 in the city of St. Petersburg. Again, I want to thank the sheriff for bringing this up, the other chiefs that are here, because this is needed in Pinellas County. And again, it's not because of anyone's action, it's because we are continuing to listen to people out there, and change is happening in St. Pete and in Pinellas County. Sorry about that, Sheriff.
Does anybody have any questions?
Sheriff, I guess who initiated this, and is it something that you think is needed?
Well, I actually think it's needed in the sense that we have to have public confidence and trust, as I said, not just in what we say happens, but what the public believes happens. So I know, without question, that we've done it right. We have been objective. We've been thorough. And as they say, the proof's in the pudding, and it shows. And nobody that I know of with any law enforcement agency in Pinellas County, and I can say that with confidence as it relates to the sheriff's office, has ever called into question how we do an investigation, what the investigative outcome is, anything surrounding what we've been doing that I know of for the last 38 years as it relates to investigating deputy use of deadly force. But just because nobody's raised it doesn't mean you wait for there to be a problem before you act. So we're being proactive. We're stepping out in front of this, recognizing, as I said, that times have changed, times continue to change, and it's still evolving. And so as we looked at it, and to get to the first part of your question, I guess the answer to that is me. I picked up the phone and I called Chiefs Holloway and Chief Slaughter. We had a joint call. We worked together on this collaboratively. And we all agreed that this is the right time and it's the right thing to do. So I would say it's very much a collaborative effort, a consensus and decision-making among all of us, that even though there is absolutely no evidence, and nobody's even raised any evidence, and believe me, if somebody had a concern, they'd raise it. We know that, and they haven't. Nobody's raised ever a concern about how we've conducted these investigations. And what I said to myself, and I think what we collectively said among ourselves, let's not wait until we have a problem or a potential issue. Because when somebody stands before you and stands before the public and says that, unfortunately and sadly, a law enforcement officer had to use deadly force, and let's say take somebody's life, and we conduct that investigation and we say that it was necessary, put it in legal terms, justifiable homicide, is that it better be right, and it better be perceived by the community to be right and the correct determination. And that's what we want. And it's probably better, when you look at it, that it come from somebody other than the person that that officer or deputy works for. Somebody other than the person that they're around all the time, they're involved with in the agency, and somebody from the outside that is going to be as objective, thorough, etc., but it is really above reproach and eliminates any potential questions that anybody can have. So that's kind of where we are. That's the discussions that we've had over the past few weeks as we've been putting this together.
Sure, you said times have changed, but is this a direct response to the George Floyd protest, basically?
Well, sure. It's a direct response to everything that's going on in the community and what we see the community is calling for. I would say that the majority of the things that we've heard in the last month or so since the Floyd incident is that we're already doing here in Pinellas County. And I would say in many places beyond Pinellas County is that we're already doing a lot of those things. When we have these discussions with whether it is citizens in community forums, whether it's protesters on the street, whether it's media or whoever it is, and people say, what about this? What about this? What about this? We already do that. We already do that. We already do that. And so, but what it's caused, and will continue to cause, because we want to do the right thing, is cause us to be introspective and cause us to look at what we're doing, how we do it, how we can do it better, and how we can really, in a ultimate way, in a penultimate way, is that having the community's trust and confidence. We cannot do our jobs effectively without community trust. And we want to do everything that we can to let everybody know that we hear you, we're listening, and we're taking the initiative ourselves. We're not going to wait for something to happen or somebody to call something out because it's something they don't like. We're trying to stay ahead of it, and we want to get ahead of it. And I can tell you, at least as far as I'm concerned, that I'm going to continue to look at it. And there's some other things that we are looking at to make some changes. There's that adage, Josh, you don't have to be sick to get better. And I think that applies to some of this, is that it's not wrong, it's not sick, but we can always be better. So let's look for ways to do it.
Sheriff, do you think your police officer or deputy is going to hesitate to draw his weapon?
What's that again?
Do you think that this will cause your police officer or deputy to hesitate to draw his weapon?
Not at all. Not at all. And one of the great things about this, and maybe if one of the chiefs wants to speak to it, is that Pinellas County law enforcement agencies have a fantastic collaboration in investigative resources. And these homicide investigators from St. Pete, from Clearwater, from the sheriff's office, and with the state attorney's office, people work together, and they work together in a collaborative way. And so they know that what's going to be done is thorough, fair, objective, and that nobody has any reason for concern. I see none of that at all. And if anything, it'll give them the confidence that when that determination is made, it's going to be accepted by the community. And what I don't want to have happen, and I'm sure the chiefs don't want to have happen, is I'm standing up here telling you, and I know it because the facts support it, but because I'm saying it about one of my people are saying, whoa, wait a minute here, should we accept what you're saying? But if it's coming from an outside entity, that's a win for everybody.
Sheriff, will this affect investigations into deaths in custody? And how is that being done now?
So you're talking about in custody, like at the jail? Is that what you're talking about? So I guess for Chief Slaughter, that's north of Almerton Road. So he's going to have to he's going to check the map out on that. So what we're going to do as far as that's concerned, and in custody deaths at the jail are different, and they don't necessarily, in fact, most of the time, it doesn't have to do with any use of force by a deputy. Usually there's other situations. So, and I've had a discussion briefly with Chief Slaughter about that. We would use and ask the task force to conduct those investigations involving deaths at the jail if it did involve, let's say, a discharge of a firearm or some type of deadly force and specific deadly force by a detention deputy. So as an example, when the inmates are out in recreation and we have the recreation towers, the deputies are armed. They have shotguns and they have other weapons. And so if a deputy at the Pinellas County jail discharged a firearm at an inmate as they're going over a wall, etc., then we would ask the task force to investigate. But as far as the normal course of business, deaths within the jail, the answer with that would be no, because it really doesn't fit the criteria for what this task force would be investigating.
And how's that being handled right now, that's in custody?
Well, again, is that any time that there's an in-custody death is that our homicide unit investigates it because it is an in-custody death. And the majority of those, though, are not at the hands, if you will, or even arguably, or have anything to do with anything that a deputy did. The majority of the in-custody deaths we have are because of medical events, and occasionally it's fights between inmates. So the majority of them have nothing to do with a deputy's actions, and so that would not be within the scope of what the task force is going to investigate. So anytime, though, there's an in-custody death, is that there is a homicide investigation. Just like the one that we had over the weekend that we put out a media alert on, is that that inmate was transferred to the hospital. It was a medical event, but our homicide investigators still investigate it because it's an in-custody death. We'll wait for the results of the autopsy from the medical examiner. They'll conduct their investigation. A lot of times when we have these in-custody deaths of inmates is that it is because of medical issues. It is not criminal whatsoever, but there's still an in-custody homicide investigation that's conducted, just to make sure.
St. Pete plans on having a citizens review board. Is there any talk about having that in the county if there isn't already one?
No, and maybe Chief Holloway wants to talk a little bit more about it. They're the only agency that I know of in Pinellas County that has had any form. And remember, there's different forms of citizen review boards, and different levels, different types. You know, some are full investigative bodies with subpoena authority and all. I don't know that any of those exist in Pinellas County, and I'm not even sure to what extent they exist in the Tampa Bay area. Do you want to talk about that at all? Sure.
So thank you, Sheriff. So our review board has been in place since 1991. So basically what happened is once a case is finally reviewed by also professional standards, then that case is forwarded to the Citizen Review Committee so they can look at the same thing, our policy and procedure, and make recommendation on things that we can add on. They do not have subpoena powers. They can call me in and ask me questions. They can call and ask the also professional detectives questions about the investigation, and we take the recommendation to see if we can make our policy stronger and better.
Why do you think something like that is so important to have?
It gives, again, that third layer for someone else to look at it, to let the citizen look at, see the job that's been done on the case, to see the evidence. They can ask more questions, so there's follow-up to that.
And then my final question would be for you, Sheriff. Thank you, Chief. And do you think that Pinellas County would consider any type of citizens review board?
You know, I don't know the answer to that. I don't think it's necessary. And, you know, but one of the things that I do know is extremely important is transparency. And so when we're talking about all of these things, I think it is extremely important that we be very clear with what we're talking about. I don't support, and I can't ever see myself supporting, a true investigative citizens review board that usurps what we do now with this process and an internal affairs investigation and a use of deadly force review board that is done automatically in these cases, where that citizens review board has subpoena authority, investigative authority, draws witnesses in, does questions, and does an investigation. I don't support that and could never see myself supporting it. But I also believe that with what we do now, and we issue the reports, and they are a public record, is that there is a high level of transparency. You know, the St. Pete model, and I'm aware of it, and others that are out there where people can come in and put eyes on it and take a look at it. You know, again, it is all about getting it out there, and, you know, once it's done and over with, and I believe that's the model that St. Pete uses, once it's done and over with, then they take a look at it, and as Chief Holloway said, they can ask questions. And that's not a model that is some anomaly. There are several agencies around the country that use something like that. But I suggest that really to some degree that can be done now. All people have to do is make a public records request and they can get all of that. We have a shooting review board, or as we call it, a use of deadly force review board, that takes the big massive investigative file, distills it down into a report. It's probably 15 or 20 pages that does have facts in it and lays it out and lets people know what happened. So anybody that wants that now, they can get it. So I can tell you that I don't have any plans in implementing any type of process like that, because I don't see the need, and nobody's asking about it, and we have the mechanisms in place where people can get all that information and they can review it themselves. So to that extent, I'd say the answer is no, but I also believe that we are at a state and time where transparency is paramount, and people have to have confidence in what we're doing. And put it another way, going the other way, a lack of transparency breeds skepticism, and skepticism breeds contempt, and we don't want any of that.
Sheriff, we don't see Tarpon Springs police up here. Do they decline?
So Tarpon Springs for the last several years has had a contract with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement to do their investigations. And Tarpon Springs has decided to remain with FDLE to do their investigations.
Sheriff, does this in any way eclipse FDLE's jurisdiction over officer-involved shootings? Can you explain how that sort of
Sure.
changes or doesn't change
Well, FDLE really doesn't have any jurisdiction over officer-involved shootings. One of the big differences between what this task force is going to do and what FDLE does, and go look at a copy of the FDLE agreements that they have with the agencies. And this is one of the reasons, like at least I speak for myself on this, and the other chiefs can speak for themselves if they want to on it, is that I think we have a better model and we have a more objective model. And one of the reasons that I say that is in the FDLE agreement that they have, they don't make any factual findings, they don't make any determinations, they don't make any recommendations. And all they do is gather the facts and give them back to the agency. So to me, that's not far enough. That isn't conducting a neutral arbiter investigation where you're coming in and you're going to make recommendations, you're going to make determinations, and I hope it never happens, but potentially make an arrest and actually conduct it as a full-fledged homicide investigation, which is what it should be. So, you know, to get to your question is that I think that we have a more objective model, one that empowers the independent agency head to control that investigation and to make the decisions that need to be made. But FDLE has no authority now other than what an agency asks them to do. So getting back to the original question, it doesn't usurp it in any way, doesn't affect it in any way. This is just a different way of doing it, and I think it's a better way, to be honest with you. And you know, this is something that the state attorney, we've communicated with him, and the state attorney supports this model and is very supportive of what we're doing.
One more question, if I may, Sheriff. Can you, to the degree that you're comfortable, can you take us inside, sort of hypothetically, the training room now for deputies? As you tell them you've created this new task force and you talk to them about those fleeting moments where they might have to make a difficult decision. Does this sort of change a little bit of what you might, can you take us inside that room, what you might tell them about that decision?
It doesn't change anything, just do the right thing. Rely on your training, rely on your experience, rely on your instincts. You're going to have to make a split-second decision, and this doesn't change anything today from what you did yesterday, the day before, the week before, the month before. Is the only thing that's different here is that the responsible entity for conducting the investigation is going to be one that's a little bit different than what you're used to. But if you do the right thing and you rely on your experience and your training, you got nothing to worry about. Just do your job. And that should not, this decision shouldn't have any impact on them whatsoever in how they do their jobs every day. This is the second time we've had a question on this, so do any of the chiefs want to comment on that at all? Anybody have any thoughts on that? I don't think it has any impact at all.
I think we need to focus on the incidents that we're talking about. So I think if you spoke directly to a police officer and he's in a situation where he thinks he's going to be killed, I think he's going to react to save his life. And I think what we owe the public here is not only a mechanism and a tool that does a fair and impartial investigation so the public has confidence, but the officer in the scenarios we're talking about is no different than any other citizen who's experienced a traumatic event or essentially attempted to be killed. And we owe it to him to do an investigation to find out if that is actually what happened. He needs to be able to, he or she needs to feel that they're going to be treated fairly just as much as the public needs to be treated fairly. So we need a system that's procedurally just on both sides of the equation. And I think that, I think we've done that. Now, the people that have elevated to these positions, you know, my colleagues, Chief Barkley, Chief Williams, who runs our Pinellas Standards Commission, Chief Holloway, Chief Hayworth, and the sheriff, you know, you rise to these occasions because you have a really strong ethical makeup. And there isn't one of us up here that wouldn't do our ethical and moral obligation to hold a person accountable that committed a crime. So there's a big difference between an officer using force justified, which we all know from the data is the majority of the time. But there are the rare anomalies in which we will have to step up and show leadership and make sure the right thing is done for the public. And there isn't anybody that's wearing a badge in Pinellas County that wouldn't do that.
You know, to answer your question, look, we are relatively normal folks doing extraordinary things under extraordinary circumstances. And it's, as when you talk about that point in time when we're about to use deadly force, and we're going to use deadly force, that is a split-second decision. And the Sheriff's right. You will rely on your training, you will rely on your experience, and you will rely on your good judgment. And so at the end of the day, when you're investigating these things, that's what the officers are going to take comfort in, knowing that someone objectively has looked at it, independently has looked at it, and it gives our community the confidence that it needs for us to do our jobs. And that's really all it is. Thanks.
Before you go, can you give name and your position quickly?
I'm sorry. I'm Chief Michael Hayward, Pinellas Park Police Department.
You know, one of the things I tell our people all the time when we conduct internal affairs investigations is that it's hard on them to go through that, especially when they know that they didn't do anything wrong and that they did right. But as hard as it is to go through it, everybody wins when we go through it because unless you conduct that hard, probing, intensive investigation and everything's vetted out, it's not above reproach. It's not above questions. It's not above skepticism. And so it's hard sometimes, and it's hard for the officers and deputies. It's hard to go through the process, but it's necessary to go through the process, and we all win. That means the officer and deputy win. That means the agency wins. That means the community wins. And so we need to go through this in a thorough but probing in an intensive way, and sometimes an uncomfortable way, because we got to make sure that we have done it right. Every rock has been turned over, and that we have asked all those necessary questions, and it's all out there, because the last thing any of us want is to not have it done right, and then later on have somebody come forward with additional information, and you find out that you didn't turn that rock over and you didn't ask the right questions, and there's something more to it. Or the other side of it is it's not perceived to have been thorough. So, you know, as far as the officers and the deputies are concerned, and, you know, my message to them is that that's what we signed up to do. And sometimes it's uncomfortable, sometimes it leaves a bad taste in your mouth. But at the end of the day, you will appreciate it and you'll be better off for it, because when one of us stands up here and tells you and tells the public that we conducted this investigation, here's what happened, is that everybody will have confidence in it, and that's what we want.
What's your message to the community, to the protesters, that you guys are working on these issues to try and build trust, and the importance of trying to build that with the community right now?
Is that we're hearing you and we're working on it. You know, my message to them is we all want the same thing. We all want it to be fair. We all want it to be impartial. We all want it to be just. You know, and I guess my message to them, and I guess my ask of them, is treat us the same way that you're asking that we treat you. Fairly, objectively, impartially. And guess what? We're all not bad. And we are trying to do it the right way, and we do it the right way the majority of the time. So don't treat us the way you claim some are treating you. And there are a whole bunch of us that are getting it right, and we do it right, and we'll continue to look for ways to make it even better. And that we are being proactive, we are being introspective, we are looking at it, we're hearing and we're listening. So, you know, work with us, but do it in a way you can have good discourse without discord, and there's a difference. And so let's talk, and open your eyes a little bit too, and look at what we are doing. You know, I've had so many discussions, and recently had some discussions where people are calling for, as an example, a better way of treating people for minor crimes. Not arresting people for first-time possession of marijuana, not arresting people for possession of marijuana paraphernalia. Well, guess what? All of us is that collectively, about 3 years ago, and this is the only county in the state of Florida that has an adult pre-arrest diversion program, where that if a cop stops you and you got a small amount of marijuana, you're not getting handcuffed, you're not getting arrested, you're not going to jail. You're going to get a card that says, go to the adult pre-arrest diversion office, do a little community service, and you don't even have an arrest record, it goes away. You go to Walmart and you steal $500 worth of stuff and it's your first time offense, you're not getting a notice to appear, you're not getting a ride to jail, you're not getting anything, is that you're getting diversion. But oh, I didn't know that. But then they say, well, we don't like cash bail. We think that the bail system is unfair, and some would say it's, you know, unduly biased. We have in Pinellas County today that we supervise about 1,500 people, 1,500 people that are out of jail in a release on recognizance program that we run, where they haven't had to post one red cent to get out of jail because we're letting them out and we're supervising them on a release on recognizance program. We have a supervised bond program where we get their bond reduced. We put them on electronic monitoring so they can get out. I can go on and on with all this stuff. So my message is that listen to us, work with us, because we're all really looking to get to the same place, and we don't have to butt heads over this.
And do you think in the long run this might impact recruitment, just because officers are under so much more pressure than ever before, and the fear of doing something wrong or not being seen in a good public light?
I think that's a given. There's no question. Well, how could it not? Is that, you know, for so many people that maybe were in the pipeline that saw this as a dream job, as a career, or as a profession they wanted to get into, you know, quite honestly, if they're not thinking about it, that's probably a problem. That's probably an issue for them. You should be thinking about it, because it has changed, it is changing, and it's evolving, and I don't think that we've figured out what the bottom is yet. So, and until we do that, then there's a lot of uncertainty. I don't think there's any doubt that it has and will continue to affect people making a decision about whether this is the right career field for them.
Sheriff, I want to make sure I have my math right. 10 homicide detectives total in the task force?
Correct. So, and so that's right. So 3 from St. Pete, Clearwater in the Sheriff's Office, 1 from Pinellas Park. But they'll be supplemented because, so as an example, let's say it's a Sheriff's deputy and the Sheriff's deputy uses deadly force in Palm Harbor. Well, our 3 are out, right? So that leaves 7. 7 is probably 3 from St. Pete, 3 from Clearwater, and 1 from Pinellas Park. You know, that's a minimum number. So they would, if they needed to draw more, then Chief Holloway could assign more, Chief Slaughter could assign more from their agencies, Chief Hayworth, et cetera. Because when you're doing these investigations, it does take, they will be the core people. They will be the case agents, they'll be the co-case agents, so they'll be the ones that are the core members of the task force, but unquestionably it will need to get supplemented. But in the case of a Sheriff's Office deputy using force, it'll never get supplemented by anybody from the Sheriff's Office. If it's in the city of St. Pete, then St. Pete won't participate. So immediately in any situation, unless it's, let's say as an example would be where the entire 10 people would participate, let's say it's a Gulfport police officer, let's say it's an Indian Shores police officer, then all 10. But in the majority of them, because of the bigger agencies, in the majority of them is they're going to lose 3 if it's one of the participants, or if Pinellas Park, we will lose 1.
Can I ask 2 really quick questions? Marcy's Law, is that retroacting? Is that going to come into play?
Is what
at all?
now, sorry?
Marcy's Law?
Marcy's Law?
Is that going to come into play at all? And then body cam?
Yeah, it's going to come into play, you know. You know, it's a problem. Marcy's Law is a problem. You know, my view of Marcy's Law is that it was never intended to be something that a law enforcement officer could assert to have their identity protected. But I also believe legally is that it does protect their identity, and the court cases that are in the pipeline now have a fair probability of coming out in that direction, and that Marcy's Law does allow them to request that their identity be withheld as a victim. And there's all kinds of legal reasoning for that, but I disagree with it. And I can't tell you how strongly I disagree with it, because when all of us signed up to do this job, is you signed up to be transparent. You signed up to live in the fishbowl. You signed up that if you engage in a deadly force incident, that your name's gonna get out there. And then there are people that say, well, protect their families, protect where they live. All that is still protected, that doesn't change. Is that a law enforcement officer's home address is confidential. There are still those protections that are in place. But remember what I said a few minutes ago is that a lack of transparency breeds suspicion. Suspicion breeds contempt. If a law enforcement officer uses deadly force and you and the public don't know who they are, and we're not telling you who they are, And nobody can find out about that officer's history, how many shootings they've had in the past, what their disciplinary record is, et cetera. That lack of transparency breeds what? It breeds suspicion. That suspicion ultimately breeds contempt. And because there's a huge unknown, we have to get it out there. But that's something we're going to have to deal with on a case-by-case basis. And I'd say that it is specifically unsettled law at this point. In Tallahassee, there's a lawsuit that is in the works, and maybe depending upon where that comes out, the legislature is going to have to act on it if they choose to fix it. But right now, I think the correct legal position, it's not the correct position, but it's the correct legal position, is that Marcy's Law probably applies. And if a cop says, I'm a victim, and I don't want you to release my identity, is that one of us, me, Chief Holloway or Chief Slaughter, are going to have to make a decision on what we do with that. It's whoever's leading that investigation. But it's a problem. And I'll be clear, is I oppose and adamantly oppose withholding the identity of any law enforcement officer from the public. I don't think it's the right thing to do.
Sheriff, how would this work?
Does anybody else want to comment on that at all? Anybody have any?
How would this work if, and this may be semantics, but if more than one agency was responding to a situation where use of deadly force, where would the resources be pulled from in that scenario?
Yeah, and sure, it can happen, and we're going to have to work that out as it comes. So let's say that it's a sheriff's deputy and a St. Pete police officer. Well, then we're both out. So then it's going to fall to the Chief Slaughter, and he's going to have to draw resources. And those resources would come from Clearwater Police Department, the agreement. When you see the MOU, you'll see that it specifically says in there that there are no limits on the resources that the agency head, who is the responsible authority for the investigation, can draw on. So he could make any requests that he needed to from within his agency. Remember, these are all three big agencies. We have a lot of people, we have a lot of resources, we have a lot of detectives, and again, we're assigning these core 10 to the task force, but that's the floor, not the ceiling. And I'm very confident that any one of the three of us is leading these investigations, and with Pinellas Park's involvement, and if they had to go outside that, would have the resources to be able to not just adequately, but to well conduct the investigation. So we are going to have to be a little bit fluid, a little bit nimble, because it could happen. And as Chief Slaughter said, thankfully we don't get this very often, but you could have a situation where all three agencies are involved, and we'll figure it out. And it may fall to Chief Hayworth to lead the investigation. We'll just have to make that call if the situation arises. I think we've dealt with all of the, I'll call them, and not that your question is not realistic, I don't mean it that way, but all of the most viable contingencies we've dealt with, and we're going to have some one-offs, and you can only, in a planning stage, you can only account for so much.
Sheriff, do you have numbers for how many use of force incidents we had in St. Pete, Clearwater, Pinellas Park, and did they end in injury, deaths?
Well, all of our use of force data is available for all of our agencies. We publish that, so it's all out there. I don't have it off the top of my head, but all of that use of force information. And remember, there's a difference between use of force and the use of deadly force, or the use of force that results in death or serious bodily injury. So be very clear, is that this task force has nothing to do with a deputy or an officer who gets into a hand-to-hand situation, has to take somebody to a round. That's a use of force incident. But this is only involving where there's a use of deadly force or force that results in death or serious bodily injury. So this task force's involvement is going to be in the very, very few times a year that we have this situation. Very few. This is not going to be something that's used all the time. But when you need it now, and it needs to be done right, as we said. But this is not for every use of force situation. All right, thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Sheriff.